It was still dark outside when Daniel stood in front of the mirror, staring at his own reflection. For the first time in years, he didn't see a billionaire, a man with private jets and glass offices overlooking the city. He saw a man who wasn't sure who he had become. His life had turned into meetings, numbers, and deals. People bowed to him because of his money, not because of who he was. Somewhere along the way, he had lost the simple connection with real people. A week ago, his assistant had shown him a report about one of his factories. Complaints from the workers. Low morale, long hours, broken equipment that never got fixed. Daniel had brushed it off at first. But then he saw a letter attached to the report. It was written by a woman who worked on the floor, describing how she and others struggled just to survive each month. She didn't sound angry, and she just sounded tired. The words stayed in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. That night, Daniel made a decision no one around him would have believed. He wanted to see his company from the inside, to walk among the people who worked for him, not as their boss, but as one of them. The idea sounded strange even to him, but something deep inside told him he needed to do it. He cut his hair short, trimmed his beard, and put on simple clothes. When he looked in the mirror again, even he barely recognized himself. His sharp suit was replaced with an old blue uniform and a pair of worn shoes. He would be known as David, a janitor hired through a local agency for a one-week contract. The next morning, he arrived at the factory before sunrise. The air smelled of oil, dust, and coffee. The security guard at the gate didn't even glance twice at him. For the first time, Daniel realized how invisible some people could feel in a world that moved too fast. Inside the building, workers were already starting their day. Machines hummed, carts rolled, and voices echoed across the wide floor. No one paid attention to the new janitor. Daniel picked up his mop and started working in a corner, carefully watching everything around him. By mid-morning, his back was already sore. The floor was sticky with spilled chemicals, and his hands smelled of bleach. It wasn't glamorous, not even close. Every few minutes, he caught himself thinking about his office. The soft chair, the air conditioning, the quiet hum of success. But then he reminded himself that this was real life for hundreds of people in his company. During lunch break, he sat alone on a crate in the corner of the hallway. He didn't bring food. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Workers passed by with small lunch boxes, some with sandwiches, others with rice packed from home. They didn't talk much. Most of them looked too tired. That was when a young woman noticed him. She was carrying her own lunch, a simple meal wrapped in foil. She stopped for a second and looked at him. "You didn't bring food?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated. "I forgot," he said. She smiled a little and tore her sandwich in half. "Here," she said, handing him one piece. "You can't work all day without eating." He wanted to refuse, but the way she offered it, gentle, without pity, made it impossible to say no. He took the food and thanked her quietly. She sat beside him, opening the rest of her meal. "You're new here," she said. "Don't worry. It gets easier after a few days." He smiled. "I hope so," she laughed lightly. "It never really does," she admitted. "But you get used to it." Daniel watched her as she ate, noticing how she looked both young and tired at the same time. Her uniform sleeves were rolled up and her hands had small cuts from working with boxes. There was kindness in her eyes, the kind that didn't fade even when life got hard. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena," she said. "I work in packaging. You?" "David," he replied, using the name he'd chosen. "Well, welcome to the team, David," she said with a small smile. "It's not the best job in the world, but at least it's honest work." Her words stayed with him. Honest work. He hadn't thought about work that way in years. After lunch, they went back to their tasks. Daniel spent the afternoon cleaning the storage rooms and sweeping the narrow aisles between machines. Every now and then, he saw Lena working nearby, lifting boxes, checking labels, helping others without being asked. She seemed to be the kind of person who made everyone's day a little easier without realizing it. When the shift finally ended, Daniel could barely stand. His arms ached, his back hurt, and his clothes smelled of sweat. Yet there was something strangely satisfying about the exhaustion. It felt real. He walked out of the building with the other workers, blending into the crowd. No one knew who he was, and for once he didn't mind. That night in his small rented room, Daniel sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. He thought about Lena sharing her lunch with him. It wasn't just food, it was kindness, something that money could never buy. He realized he hadn't felt that kind of warmth from anyone in a long time. The next morning, he went back to the factory before sunrise again. The workers greeted each other with sleepy smiles, and the machines started up one by one. Lena waved at him from across the floor. "Morning, David," she called. He waved back, feeling an unfamiliar sense of comfort. Throughout the day, Daniel worked quietly, but he watched everything closely: how the supervisor spoke to the workers, how little breaks they got, how often people pushed themselves past their limits. He noticed small things too: a man with worn-out shoes still helping others lift heavy boxes, a woman covering for her coworker who was late, laughter shared even in exhaustion. It was a world he'd never truly seen, even though he owned it. During lunch, Lena sat beside him again. This time he had brought food from a nearby store, simple bread and fruit. He offered some to her and she smiled. "You didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to," he replied. They ate together in silence for a while. Then she spoke. "You seem different," she said. "Most new guys complain a lot, but you don't say much." Daniel smiled faintly. "I guess I just like to listen," she nodded. "Listening's good. People here don't get listened to much. Everyone's just trying to make it through the day." He could hear a quiet sadness behind her words. He wanted to ask more, but she quickly changed the subject, asking where he came from and if he had a family. Daniel gave vague answers, careful not to reveal too much. Later that afternoon, a small accident happened near one of the machines. A worker slipped on a wet floor. Daniel rushed to help before anyone else moved. Together with Lena, he helped the man sit up and called for first aid. The supervisor arrived shouting orders, more concerned about the delay than the injured worker. Daniel felt anger rising inside him, but he stayed quiet. He reminded himself that he was here to learn, to see the truth, not to reveal himself. By the end of the second day, he had already seen enough to know that things needed to change. But he also realized something else. People like Lena were the heart of his company. They were the reason everything kept moving, even when no one thanked them. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the way Lena had said, "People here don't get listened to much." He thought about how he had spent years in meetings about growth, profits, and expansion, but never once sat in the room with the people who worked the hardest. He looked around his small room again. The walls were plain, the furniture old, but for some reason he felt more grounded here than in his luxurious penthouse. The next few days went by quickly. Daniel worked hard, cleaning, carrying, helping wherever he could. Lena continued to bring small gestures of kindness: a bottle of water when he looked tired, a spare sandwich when he forgot his meal again. She never treated him like someone beneath her. To her, everyone deserved the same kindness. Sometimes they talked during short breaks. She told him about her daughter, a little girl who loved drawing and wanted to be a teacher someday. She told him how she worked extra shifts to buy school books, and how she dreamed of saving enough for her daughter's future. Daniel listened quietly, his heart heavy. He couldn't remember the last time he'd met someone so selfless. One afternoon, when everyone else was rushing to finish before closing time, Daniel noticed Lena sitting alone for a moment, rubbing her wrists. "You okay?" he asked. She smiled weakly. "Just tired, but it's fine. I'm used to it." He wanted to say something comforting, something meaningful, but words failed him. He simply nodded. That evening, as the workers left the factory, Daniel stayed back a little longer, looking around the place. The walls were faded, the air thick with dust, the lights flickering. He realized that for the first time, he wasn't just seeing a factory. He was seeing lives. And in those lives, he saw stories, dreams, and silent struggles that no report could ever describe. When he walked out that night, he looked up at the sky and whispered to himself, this was the right choice. He didn't know it yet, but the woman who had shared her sandwich on the first day had already changed something inside him, and by the end of the week she would change his life completely. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He had started to feel more comfortable among the workers, but he also knew that the week was still young and there was so much more to see. He put on his uniform, laced up his worn shoes, and stepped into the factory. The familiar hum of machines greeted him, along with the chatter of workers moving about, preparing for another long day. Lena was already there, sorting boxes with careful hands. She looked up when she saw him and smiled. her eyes bright. Tea despite the early hour. "Good morning, David," she called out. He waved back, feeling a small warmth in his chest. For some reason, the greeting felt like more than just politeness. It felt like a connection. Throughout the morning, Daniel continued with his tasks. He scrubbed floors, emptied trash bins, and carried supplies from one area to another. The work was exhausting, and his body was beginning to feel the strain in ways he had forgotten existed. His hands were rough, his back ached, and sweat dripped down his face. Yet he noticed that Lena moved with a grace he hadn't expected. Even when tired, she worked efficiently and helped others without complaint. At lunchtime, Daniel again found himself sitting alone in the corner. He hadn't prepared food, expecting to eat later, but his stomach grumbled loudly. He noticed Lena approaching, holding her small lunch in her hands. "You look hungry," she said softly, offering him half of her sandwich. Daniel hesitated, but then accepted it. The gesture, simple as it was, touched him more than he could put into words. He realized how rare such kindness was in the world he had left behind, a world full of money and transactions, but often empty of genuine human care. As they sat together, Lena started talking about her day-to-day life. She shared stories of her daughter, her dreams, and the challenges she faced as a single mother. Daniel listened intently, feeling a mixture of admiration and guilt. He had lived a life of luxury without ever worrying about where his next meal would come from, while Lena faced hardship every single day. "I try to keep a smile for my daughter," she said quietly. "Even when I'm tired or upset, I want her to believe that life can be good." Daniel nodded. He didn't respond immediately, not because he didn't want to, but because he realized that words felt inadequate. How could he express to her that her small act of sharing food and her tireless kindness were changing him, reshaping the way he saw the world? The afternoon brought more challenges. A large shipment arrived, and the workers scrambled to unload it. Daniel lifted boxes alongside them, feeling the strain in his arms and shoulders. He noticed Lena helping a colleague who had twisted her ankle, guiding her to a chair and making sure she was comfortable. Daniel saw the patience and care she exhibited and understood that her strength was not just physical, but emotional. She carried more than boxes. She carried the weight of responsibility, compassion, and hope. As the shift ended, Daniel lingered behind, cleaning the last area before the lights went out. He watched Lena walk toward the exit, holding her lunchbox tightly and smiling at the other workers. There was a quiet dignity in the way she moved, an unspoken pride in doing her best despite the hardships she faced. That evening, Daniel returned to his small rented room, exhausted but filled with thoughts he couldn't shake. He thought about the inequality he had witnessed, the subtle injustices, and the strength of people like Lena who kept going regardless of circumstances. He realized that he had spent so much of his life focusing on profits, meetings, and deals, without ever stopping to truly understand the human beings who made his business possible. The next day, Daniel's schedule didn't change, but his perspective deepened. He began to notice details he had missed before. A worker quietly offering water to a colleague, a small smile exchanged between exhausted employees, the way Lena organized the supplies so everything would be easier for the next shift. He saw their resilience, their quiet determination, and their unwillingness to let hardship define them. During lunch, Lena once again shared her food with him. This time, Daniel had brought a small portion of fruit, which he offered to her. She smiled and accepted it graciously. As they ate, she asked about his background, curious about his experiences and where he had learned to work hard. Daniel offered vague answers, careful not to reveal his true identity. Despite his carefulness, he felt a strange comfort in these moments. He realized that sharing a meal, talking about life, and simply listening to someone could build a connection far more meaningful than any business deal he had ever made. As the week progressed, Daniel began to anticipate these lunches with Lena. They became moments of reflection and understanding, small pockets of humanity in the midst of exhaustion. He found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, sharing small pieces of his thoughts and feelings without revealing who he really was. One afternoon, a problem arose with one of the machines. It had jammed, and the workers were struggling to fix it. Daniel stepped forward, offering assistance. He didn't have technical expertise, but he helped in any way he could, moving parts, holding tools, and providing encouragement. Lena noticed his efforts and nodded in appreciation, her eyes reflecting respect rather than pity. By now, Daniel had started to feel like a part of the team, not an outsider. He had learned the names of several workers, understood the rhythm of the factory, and appreciated the challenges they faced daily. He realized that leadership was not about giving orders from a distance, but about understanding the struggles of those you lead and supporting them in meaningful ways. Late in the week, a small celebration took place. One of the workers had a birthday, and the team gathered to share a simple cake and sing quietly. Daniel watched from the sidelines, feeling a mix of emotions. The joy was simple, genuine, and infectious. He realized that these moments, often overlooked by management, were the true heartbeat of the workplace. Lena smiled at him, offering a piece of cake, and he accepted it, feeling grateful not just for the food but for the human connection it represented. As the week neared its end, Daniel reflected on what he had experienced. The exhaustion, the small acts of kindness, the laughter, and the struggles had given him a perspective he could never have gained from an office window. He had seen the human side of his company, the people who kept it running, and the resilience that often went unnoticed. On the final day, Daniel prepared himself for the last shift. He felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety, knowing that soon he would reveal his true identity to the people he had come to respect deeply. He wondered how they would react, whether they would feel betrayed, angry, or amazed. Yet he also knew that this revelation was necessary, not for his ego, but to honor the people who had unknowingly touched his heart. That morning, Lena greeted him with her usual smile. "Morning, David," she said. "Ready for the last day?" Daniel smiled back. "I think so," he said, feeling a nervous flutter in his stomach. Throughout the day, he worked with even more care, paying attention to every detail, helping wherever he could, and learning as much as possible. He noticed the small things: a coworker quietly wiping a tear, another helping a friend carry a heavy box, and Lena encouraging everyone with a simple word or gesture. He realized that these small acts of humanity were what truly held the factory together, not just the machines or the profits. As the shift ended, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had entered the factory to learn about hardship and work, but he had discovered something much more valuable: the kindness, strength, and resilience of people like Lena. She had shown him that even the smallest gestures could have profound effects, and he had learned that leadership required empathy, understanding, and genuine care for others. Walking out of the factory that evening, Daniel felt changed. The week had been exhausting, eye-opening, and deeply moving. He had learned lessons that no amount of money could teach. He had witnessed human strength, kindness, and courage in their purest forms, and he had formed a bond with someone who represented the best of humanity. As he looked at the city lights from the street outside, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never forget what he had seen, and he would find a way to honor the people who had touched his life in such a profound way. Lena's simple act of sharing her lunch had sparked a transformation in him, one that would influence not only his decisions, but the way he lived his life from that moment forward. That night, Daniel sat quietly in his small room, reflecting on the week. He thought about Lena, the workers, and the stories they had shared with him. He realized that the true measure of wealth was not in the money he had accumulated, but in the ability to see, understand, and uplift others. The week had changed him, and he knew that the coming days would bring even more revelations, more challenges, and more opportunities to connect with the people who had unknowingly shown him the real value of life. He closed his eyes, feeling a mix of exhaustion and fulfillment. The journey was far from over, but the lessons of the week had already begun to reshape his world. The experience had planted a seed of empathy and understanding that would continue to grow, guiding his actions and decisions in ways he could not yet fully imagine. And at the heart of it all was Lena, the young woman who had shared her lunch without hesitation, whose kindness had reminded him of what truly mattered. She had no idea that she had changed the life of a man who had everything yet understood so little about the world outside his offices. Daniel knew one thing for certain. The week as a janitor was more than a disguise or a lesson in labor. It was a journey into the heart of humanity, a journey that would forever alter the way he saw himself, his company, and the people who made it all possible. The final day had not yet come, but Daniel felt ready. Ready to face the truth, ready to reveal who he really was and ready to honor the kindness and strength he discovered in the unlikeliest of places. The factory felt different that morning. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped through the gates. The sunlight streamed in through the high windows, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. The hum of machines was familiar, but today there was a subtle energy in the air. Workers moved quickly, speaking in low voices, some glancing curiously at the new janitor, as if sensing that something was about to change. Daniel adjusted his cap and uniform and took a deep breath. He felt stronger than the first few days, not because his muscles were less sore, but because he had begun to understand the rhythm of life here. He was no longer an outsider watching from a distance. He was part of the world he had once overlooked, even if no one knew who he really was. Lena was already at her station, carefully stacking boxes and checking labels. She looked up and gave him a small wave. "Morning," she said, her voice carrying the same warmth and simplicity that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "Morning," Daniel replied. He smiled to himself, noticing how natural it felt to greet her now, without the barriers of status or wealth. The day began with the usual tasks, sweeping floors, carrying supplies, and cleaning up spills. Daniel moved with more confidence, helping workers where he could and learning the small but essential details of their work. He began to notice patterns he hadn't seen before, how certain machines were always prone to jamming, how some workers relied on each other for support, and how small gestures of care could make a big difference in the flow of the factory. At lunchtime, Lena approached him again, carrying her modest meal. She had a gentle smile, as if it had become routine to share these moments together. "I saved a little for you," she said, offering him half of her sandwich. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then accepted it gratefully. "Thank you," he said quietly. He realized that these simple interactions had become the highlight of his days, a small anchor in a week filled with exhaustion and discovery. They ate together in silence for a few moments, letting the sounds of the factory settle around them. Then Lena spoke softly, her eyes focused on the sandwich in her hands. "Do you ever wonder if things will ever get easier?" she asked. Daniel paused. He wanted to answer honestly, but he wasn't sure how much to reveal. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "but I think it's important to keep trying even when it's hard." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's what I tell my daughter. Life isn't easy, but you have to keep going. Even when you're tired, even when you're scared, you have to keep going." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't expected. She was a woman who had faced struggles most people would never understand, and yet she spoke with hope, resilience, and quiet courage. After lunch, the work continued. A shipment of heavy crates arrived, and the workers scrambled to unload them. Daniel joined in, lifting boxes and moving carts, feeling the strain in his arms and back. Lena moved alongside him, helping a younger worker who struggled with the weight of a crate. Daniel noticed how she didn't complain or seek recognition. She simply did what needed to be done. By mid-afternoon, a problem arose with one of the machines. It had jammed again, and the workers were unsure how to fix it. Daniel stepped forward, offering to help. He didn't have the technical expertise, but he could lend an extra pair of hands and a fresh perspective. Lena noticed his efforts and gave him an encouraging nod. Together, they worked to clear the jam, coordinating with the others and keeping spirits high despite the frustration. As they finished, one of the older workers clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Not bad for a new guy," he said with a grin. Daniel smiled, feeling a strange sense of pride. It wasn't pride in his abilities or strength, but pride in being part of something larger, in contributing to the team and understanding the effort it took to keep the factory running. The rest of the afternoon passed with a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Daniel continued his cleaning, observed the workflow, and helped wherever he could. He began to notice small details, the way Lena's hands moved as she packed boxes, the way she encouraged others with a word or gesture, the way the workers quietly supported each other without being asked. These details, he realized, were the true foundation of the factory, not the machines or profits. During a short break, Daniel and Lena sat together again. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, filled with scribbles about her daughter's schoolwork and her own plans for the future. "I like to keep track of things," she said with a shy smile. It helps me feel like I have some control even when life is messy. Daniel nodded. He understood more than she could know. Life for the workers was often messy, unpredictable, and exhausting. Yet here was Lena, finding ways to plan, dream, and care for those around her. He realized that her strength wasn't just in her work ethic, but in her spirit, her ability to remain kind and hopeful despite the difficulties. As the day drew to a close, Daniel found himself reflecting on everything he had seen and experienced. The exhaustion he felt was different now. It was meaningful. He had begun to understand the value of work, the importance of community, and the impact of small acts of kindness. Lena had become more than just a coworker. She had become a symbol of resilience, empathy, and quiet courage. That evening, Daniel returned to his small room, physically drained but emotionally stirred. He thought about the conversations with Lena, the moments of shared meals, and the lessons he had learned from the workers around him. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to the world outside his office, a sense of understanding that went beyond numbers and profits. The following morning, Daniel returned to the factory with a renewed sense of purpose. He greeted the workers with a genuine smile, noticing the small things that had gone unnoticed before: a worn-out pair of shoes, a hesitant smile, a tired but determined expression. He realized that these small details were the heartbeat of the factory, the signs of human effort and resilience that often went unrecognized. Lena approached him with her usual warmth, carrying a small bag of lunch. "I saved a little for you again," she said. "I figured you might be hungry." Daniel accepted it gratefully. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know what I would do without you." She smiled, brushing off the compliment with humility. "It's nothing," she said. "I just want to help. That's all." As they sat together, Daniel felt a deep sense of respect and admiration for her. She had faced challenges he could hardly imagine, yet she remained kind, generous, and full of hope. Her actions reminded him of what truly mattered in life: connection, compassion, and the willingness to support others without expecting anything in return. Throughout the day, Daniel continued to work alongside the employees, noticing more and more how much effort went into every task, every machine, every box. He began to see the factory not just as a place of production, but as a community, a group of people who relied on each other, supported each other, and persevered despite difficulties. During a mid-afternoon break, Daniel noticed Lena sitting quietly, rubbing her hands as if she were tired. He approached her and offered a small word of encouragement. She looked up, smiling faintly. "I'm fine," she said. "Just tired. But it's okay. I'm used to it." Daniel nodded, understanding more than she could know. He realized that people like Lena carried burdens silently, choosing to remain strong for the sake of others. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, not as a supervisor or a boss, but as someone who now truly saw their struggles and wanted to make a difference. As the week neared its end, Daniel found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He had come to the factory seeking understanding, but he had discovered something deeper: the power of kindness, the strength of resilience, and the importance of empathy. Lena had shown him that even the smallest gestures could have profound effects, and the workers around him had demonstrated the value of hard work, patience, and support. On the final day, Daniel prepared himself for what he knew would be a turning point. He had spent the week observing, listening, and learning, and now it was time to reveal his true identity. He felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, unsure how the workers would react, but confident that the lessons he had learned would guide him through. As he entered the factory that morning, he greeted the workers with warmth, noticing the small details that had become familiar over the past week. Lena smiled at him, her presence a comforting reminder of why he had undertaken this journey in the first place. Throughout the day, Daniel worked diligently, helping wherever he could, listening closely, and participating fully in the life of the factory. He felt a deep connection to the people around him, a bond forged through shared effort, respect, and understanding. By the end of the shift, he knew that the moment of revelation had arrived. He would no longer be David, the janitor who had learned about work and kindness. He would step forward as Daniel, the man who had once been distant and removed, now ready to honor the people who had taught him what truly mattered. As the workers began to leave, Daniel felt his heart racing. He thought about Lena, about her strength, her kindness, and her unwavering spirit. She had changed him without even knowing it, reminding him that the true measure of a person was not wealth or status, but the ability to care, to give, and to support others. He took a deep breath, ready to take the first step toward revealing the truth, knowing that the lessons of this week would stay with him forever. The next morning started differently. The factory floor was busier than usual. Workers were rushing around, cleaning every corner and arranging boxes in perfect lines. The air felt tense and nervous, and nobody was smiling like they usually did. Something big was about to happen. "Did you hear?" whispered one worker to another near the packaging line. "The CEO is visiting today." "The real boss. They say he's coming himself." Everyone froze for a second, then started working even faster. The supervisors walked around with clipboards, shouting for people to look sharp and move quickly. Even the security guards seemed extra serious, watching every doorway. In the corner, the janitor, still in his plain blue uniform, was mopping the floor near the hallway. His head was slightly bent, and a calm expression rested on his face. Nobody suspected that this quiet man was the very billionaire they were all preparing to meet. He kept mopping slowly, listening to the anxious chatter around him. Some workers were scared they'd lose their jobs if anything went wrong. Others just hoped the boss would notice how hard they worked. One person, though, wasn't worried about herself. It was the same young woman who always found a way to help others even when she had so little. She had been working extra shifts all week, saving every little bit she could for her daughter's school needs. But that morning, even with all the chaos, she took a moment to walk toward the janitor. She carried a small lunchbox in her hands. "You probably won't have time to eat today," she said with a soft smile. "Here, take this before it gets cold." He looked up at her, his eyes warm with gratitude. "You always think of others first," he said quietly. She smiled shyly. "It's nothing, really. Just food, we all need it, right?" He nodded. For a moment, he wanted to tell her everything. That he wasn't who she thought he was. That he was the man running this whole place. But something inside him said to wait. He wanted her kindness to remain pure, untouched by titles or money. As the morning went on, everyone became more restless. Around noon, a black car arrived outside the factory gates. It was shiny and sleek, the kind that most workers only saw in magazines. When the doors opened, a small group of executives stepped out dressed in expensive suits. The factory manager followed them nervously, adjusting his tie every few seconds. "Everyone in line," he shouted. "The CEO will be here any minute. Stand straight, don't talk, and don't make a mess of yourselves." The janitor stood off to the side, pretending to keep mopping. But his heart was beating faster. He could see the surprise on their faces already, even before it happened. He had planned this moment carefully. When the workers gathered in a neat line, whispering to one another, the manager proudly announced, "Everyone, please welcome our respected CEO, Mr. Daniel Huxley." But when no one stepped forward from the car, people started to look around. The manager's face turned pale. "Sir?" he called out. "Mr. Huxley?" At that very moment, the janitor placed his mop against the wall. He slowly removed his cap, straightened his shoulders, and walked forward. The room fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The manager's mouth fell open. What is this?" he stammered. Daniel looked around at the faces in front of him, faces tired from long shifts, hands rough from work, eyes full of confusion and surprise. He took a deep breath and said, "You all know me as the janitor who started here a week ago. But that wasn't the whole truth. I'm Daniel Huxley, and this week I came here not as your boss but as one of you." For a few seconds nobody spoke. It was as if time had frozen. Then whispers began to spread through the crowd. Some couldn't believe it. Others looked at him with wide eyes, trying to understand why someone so rich would spend a week scrubbing floors. The manager looked horrified. "Sir, I didn't know. If I had known—" Daniel raised a hand gently to stop him. "That's the point," he said softly. "You weren't supposed to know. I wanted to see what it really feels like to work here, to see how my people live, to learn how the smallest mistakes affect those who have no power to speak up." He turned toward the workers, his eyes calm but filled with emotion. "I've learned more in 1 week here than I did in 10 years sitting in my office. I saw how hard you all work, how much you give, how much you care for each other when no one else does." The young woman stood in the back holding her lunchbox tightly, her eyes glistening with disbelief. She had fed this man, laughed with him, and shared her small worries with him, never knowing he was the person who could change everything. Daniel walked slowly toward her. Everyone moved aside as he approached. He stopped in front of her and said quietly, "You've been kind to me when you didn't have to be. You shared what little you had even when your own days were hard." Her lips trembled. "I didn't know who you were," she said softly. He smiled. "That's exactly why it meant so much." A quiet murmur filled the room as everyone watched. Some of the workers wiped their eyes. Others clapped softly, unsure if it was the right moment, but moved by what they were seeing. Daniel turned back to the crowd. "I've seen enough to know that changes must be made. Not tomorrow. Not next month. But now." The manager looked uneasy. "Sir, may I?" Daniel interrupted kindly. "You've done your job the way you thought was right. But it's time we do better. Every person here deserves respect and fair treatment. That starts with listening, not commanding." He spoke from the heart, not like a man reading from a speech, but like someone who had walked in their shoes. He told them about the nights he had spent cleaning, about the pain in his arms, the ache in his back, and how he'd realized how much strength it took to do their jobs day after day. As he talked, something shifted in the room. The fear and tension began to fade. People started to look at him not as a distant billionaire, but as someone who understood them. He looked at the young woman again. "You said once that kindness doesn't cost anything. You were right, but it can change everything." She blinked back tears, unsure what to say. Her hands trembled as she held the lunchbox. "I just wanted to help," she whispered. "And you did," he said with a gentle smile. "More than you know." He looked around the room once more. "This factory will change. The way we treat our workers will change. You have my word." Applause started quietly from the back and slowly grew louder until the entire hall was filled with clapping and cheers. Some workers smiled through tears. For the first time in a long while, they felt seen. The manager stood awkwardly at the side, unsure what to do. Daniel turned toward him and said kindly, "You've been here a long time. You'll help lead these changes. But from now on, lead with empathy." The man nodded, his face pale but respectful. As the workers went back to their duties later that afternoon, the energy in the building felt completely different. People smiled at each other. The weight they had carried for so long seemed a little lighter. The young woman sat in the corner for a while, still trying to process what had just happened. Her friend nudged her playfully. "You gave the boss your lunch. Can you believe that?" She laughed nervously. "I didn't give the boss lunch. I gave it to someone who looked hungry." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the factory roof, Daniel walked outside quietly. The parking lot was almost empty. He looked back at the building, its tall windows glowing with warm light, and smiled to himself. He had spent a week as a janitor and found something he didn't even know he was missing: humility, gratitude, and the true meaning of success. He knew that the hardest part wasn't over yet. Promising change was easy. Making it happen would take time. But he was ready. As he drove away, he thought about the young woman again. Her kindness had been the start of it all. She had shown him that compassion still existed in a world driven by greed and competition. He whispered softly to himself, "Kindness is the real wealth." And somewhere inside that factory, a tired young woman finished her shift, completely unaware that her small act of goodness had just changed her future and the lives of everyone who worked beside her. A week passed since the truth came out. The story of the billionaire who had worked as a janitor quietly spread among the workers. At first, some thought it was just a strange rumor. But when they saw how things began to change, they realized it was real. Daniel kept his promise. He didn't disappear back into his office like most powerful people might have done. He came to the factory every morning for the next few days. Not in a suit, not in a car with tinted windows, but dressed simply, with a notepad in his hand. He sat with the workers during lunch breaks, listened to their problems, and asked what they needed most. At first, people were shy. They weren't used to a boss who cared about their stories. But slowly they began to speak. One man told him about how the old machines often broke down, forcing them to work longer hours. Another woman said the medical support was too limited. Some mentioned how much it would mean to have a daycare for their children so they wouldn't have to worry while working. Daniel wrote everything down. He didn't interrupt or argue. He just listened. And when people finished, he looked at them with the same calm eyes he had when he was the janitor. "Thank you," he would say. "You're helping me fix what I didn't see before." Word spread fast that the boss was truly changing the ease. Within a month, new safety gear arrived. The factory floor was repaired. The lunch breaks were extended so no one had to eat in a rush. Small changes? Yes. But they meant the world to the people who had been ignored for years. But Daniel hadn't forgotten about one person, the woman who had unknowingly touched his heart with a simple act of kindness. He thought about her often, about the way she shared her food with him, about the way she never asked for anything in return. He asked one of the supervisors quietly about her situation. "She's one of our best workers," the man said. "Single mother, always on time, never complains even when life isn't easy for her." Daniel nodded slowly. "Does she ever take a day off?" "Hardly ever," the man replied. "She says every day she works means another meal for her little girl." Hearing that made Daniel pause for a moment. He remembered how her face had lit up when she talked about her daughter, how her eyes softened every time she mentioned her dream of giving her child a better future. A few days later, Daniel called for a meeting at the factory. This time there was no nervous tension, no fear. People were smiling when they gathered. They trusted him now. He had earned it not with speeches but with actions. When everyone was there, Daniel stood in front of them holding a small envelope in his hand. His voice was calm, almost emotional. "A few weeks ago," he began, "I came here as someone pretending to be a janitor. But what I found here was real. I saw honesty, hard work, and kindness that money can't buy." He looked around the crowd, then continued. "One person here reminded me what it means to be human. She didn't know who I was. She didn't care about my title. She simply cared about another person, and that small act changed everything for me." Everyone turned to look around, whispering quietly, wondering who he was talking about. The young woman stood near the back, clutching her gloves, confused. Then Daniel smiled softly and said her name. "Can you please come here?" Her eyes widened. The room fell silent as she slowly walked to the front. Her steps were hesitant, her heart beating fast. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. When she reached him, Daniel spoke gently. "You showed me kindness when I had nothing to offer. You taught me something I'd forgotten long ago, that the smallest act can change a life. So today I want to return that kindness." He handed her the envelope. She looked down at it, her fingers trembling. "Sir, I don't understand," she whispered. "Open it," he said kindly. Inside was a letter and a document. She began to read, her hands shaking as her eyes moved across the paper. Tears welled up before she even finished. The letter said that Daniel had arranged a full scholarship for her daughter's education, covering everything from school fees to books and uniforms. It also said that she was being promoted to a supervisor position, with better pay and shorter working hours so she could spend more time with her child. The crowd erupted into applause. Some clapped, others wiped tears from their faces. It was a moment no one in that factory would ever forget. The young woman looked up at him, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. I didn't do anything special. Daniel smiled gently. "You did more than you think. You gave me something I couldn't buy with all my money. You reminded me what being human really means." She covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head slightly. "No, thank you." The applause grew louder. Even the managers and supervisors joined in, realizing they were witnessing something rare, a moment of pure humanity in a world that often forgets about it. That night, after everyone had gone home, Daniel stood alone in the factory. The lights were dim and the soft hum of machines filled the air. He walked slowly across the same floor he had once mopped, remembering how heavy that mop had felt in his hands. He smiled quietly. That week had changed him forever. He had gone from being a man lost in luxury to someone who understood the real meaning of wealth. It wasn't about cars or mansions or bank accounts. It was about kindness, connection, and people. He thought of the young woman again, how her generosity had sparked a change not just in him, but in everyone around her. He knew she would continue spreading that kindness, not because she had to, but because that was who she was. Months passed. The factory became known as one of the best workplaces in the region. Productivity rose, but so did happiness. People smiled more. They helped each other more. And the woman who once struggled silently now led her team with confidence and care. Just like she had once shared her food, with warmth and sincerity. Her daughter began her new school full of hope and excitement. Every day when she came home with her small backpack, her mother's eyes filled with pride. One evening as they sat together, the little girl said, "Mama, when I grow up, I want to be kind like you." She hugged her daughter tightly. "That's the best thing you can ever be," she whispered. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his quiet visits to different factories. He no longer looked for numbers or profits. He looked for people, their stories, their struggles, their dreams. He created programs to help workers' families, built small libraries, and opened health clinics for employees. But no matter how many good things he did, he never forgot that it all started because of one woman and one simple lunch shared out of kindness. One day, he returned to that same factory for a visit. The workers greeted him warmly, and when the young woman saw him, she smiled. They sat together for a few minutes during lunch. She offered him a small lunchbox again, just like she had on that first day. He laughed softly. "Still sharing your food, I see," she smiled back. "Some habits don't change." He took the lunchbox, opened it, and said, "And thank goodness for that." They both laughed, the sound echoing gently through the room. Around them, workers talked, laughed, and shared meals, something that had once seemed impossible. As Daniel left the factory that day, he looked back one last time. He felt a deep sense of peace knowing that life had come full circle. He had entered that place as a man searching for answers and left as someone who had finally found them. True success, he realized, wasn't measured in wealth or recognition. It was found in the quiet moments when one person's kindness touches another, and that small spark grows into something far greater than either of them imagined. He got into his car, looked up at the sky, and smiled to himself. "A week as a janitor," he whispered softly. "That's what it took to find what I'd lost." And with that, he drove away, not just as a billionaire, but as a man who understood the true meaning of being rich. Because in the end, it wasn't the money that changed lives, it was kindness. Always kindness.